The 2000s have been marked by societal change. With the first black president, the legalization of gay marriage, and numerous other events driving towards social progress, there's a lot of positive change occurring in our society. With all this in mind, we still have a long way to go. Bias such as sexism still runs fervently through our culture, manifesting itself in subtle laws and mindsets. Even today, women still only earn 79 cents on the dollar to men. Of the Fortune 500 CEOs, only 32 were women. And last year, Glamour released an article called The Cost of Being a Woman, which focused on the higher prices of women's products. For example, women's deodorant's $5.99, whereas men's is $3.29. How's that fair? These sexist themes can be seen carried out in cultural phenomena such as sports. According to Forbes magazine, the U.S. women's national team earned $2 million for their 2015 World Cup victory. Everything looks all right here until we compare this victory to the U.S. men's national team that came in 11th in 2014, yet they collected $9 million. The gender wage gap for coaches is extremely high as well. At Duke University, the men's basketball coach makes almost $10 million annually, whereas the women's basketball coach makes a little over $700,000. Some make the argument men's sports generate more profit, so these wage discrepancies are logical. But when you look at the core issue, you see that men's sports are not promoted, evaluated, or even organized in the same structure of women's, creating a culture that unfairly praises men's sports without giving women's the same benefits. Unfortunately, sexism is deeply rooted in sports history.
One example that has made a huge impact in women's sports and highlights the inherent sexism of women's sports is Kathrine Switzer. In fact, she was the first ever registered woman to run the Boston Marathon. She really challenged everything that went against women's sports at the time. In fact, her coach said a woman was too fragile to run a marathon. She registered under the gender-neutral name KV Switzer because women weren't allowed to run in the marathon at that time. In fact, Jock Semple, a marathon official, tried to physically remove her from the race, shouting, "Get the hell out of my race." Despite this, her boyfriend at the time was a 235-pound professional football player that shoved him out of the way, who was running right next to her. She finished with a time of 4 hours and 20 minutes. After this, the AAU banned women from all races with males, and violators of this rule would never be able to compete in a race again. It wasn't until 1972 that women were allowed to compete in the Boston Marathon, a whole 5 years after this incident. Although this is one example of sexism in sports, the nature of it started way earlier, with the first feminist movement resulted in modest gains for women in sports and intercollegiate competitions, but these gains were negated by the Depression in the 1930s. The expectations of society were that a woman's place was in the home, which pushed aside the idea that there were psychological and physiological benefits to be gained from sports. The 1940s brought war to the United States, and millions of men entered into the military. Many women joined the military service or left their positions as homemakers to fill the void left in the workforce, earning the moniker Rosie the Riveter. They demonstrated that they were equal to the task, proving that women could do anything that men could. It wasn't until the 1950s and 60s the social conscience of America was changing. The push for civil rights, which culminated in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, helped increase the status of women and minorities. This new wave of feminism, with the larger social reforms sought by the civil rights movement, moved women closer to the legislative action for greater equal treatments in athletics. In fact, the concept that federal legislation was to eliminate sexual discrimination was the main focus of women's groups in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Then, Title IX was passed. It was only after Title IX was passed when the question surrounding implementation arose. The opposition to the Title IX took place. After the passage of Title IX, Congress built in a 6-year period for secondary and post-secondary schools to achieve compliance. The critical element lacking the passage of Title IX was the implementation of the legislation that would specify how it was to be applied and to whom. In fact, the NCAA became conserved by what it perceived to be the potential weakening of its position as the dominant and controlling body of intercollegiate athletics. The first approach of the NCAA when faced with the threat of equality in intercollegiate athletics was to attempt to limit Title IX's application. The NCAA decided to introduce women's championships for intercollegiate sports by offering the institutions sponsoring women's sports a proposition that ultimately led to the demise of the AIAW. The NCAA offered to pay all expenses for teams competing in a national championship, charge no additional membership fees for schools to add women's programs, create financial aid, recruitment and eligibility rules that were the same for women as for men, and finally guarantee women more television coverage. Sexism actually starts really early for boys and girls. Girls and boys are pushed into male or female sports from a very young age. One example of these differences in sports is lacrosse. Lacrosse is girls aren't allowed to hit each other and be aggressive like the sport is intended to, like males can. And in fact, females don't have pads, and a lot of the times referees would blow the whistle for a soft foul or a very soft hit. Interviewing a friend of mine, she felt that it was frustrating because boys can play a lot harder than girls could, and felt like she couldn't actually play the sport as it is inherently sexist, and not thinking that girls could actually play a full contact sport.
Sexism in sports only increases as girls get older. A case study was done into UCLA's Title IX compliance back in 2014. Title IX states that UCLA has to show that women make up about 56% of its athletes because they make up that share of the overall student population. The school reported having 127 rowers, almost twice the NCAA average, and far higher than the 45 on its public roster for the 2014-2015 season. In reaching out to 64 of the students whom the school had counted but weren't on its roster, more than 2/3 of them had said they had never been on the team. The investigation also found that UCLA is counting dozens of male athletes as women. The most striking example, the women's basketball team reports having 36 players, but 19 of them are male practice players. Department of Education rules allow UCLA and other schools to do this.
With this, out of college, sexism only continues to get worse. The coverage of women's sports is peppered with disguised sexism, according to new research. In fact, there's a 25-year-old study that suggests dull, lackluster coverage that makes female sports events seem less exciting than men's, and this would harm everything from women's athlete salaries to even the ticket sales at the event. The team of researchers found women's sports coverage tended to be overtly sexist from 1989 to 1999, trivializing by linking women to their conventional roles as mothers, wives, and girlfriends from 1999 to 2009. But in recent years, now based on the most recent data from 2014, coverage actually depicts women's sports in a lackluster manner, which this team of researchers call gender-blind sexism. In fact, SportsCenter's segments on men's sports averaged 2 minutes and 5 seconds, and stories about men's sports as on local stations average about 47 seconds. But women's stories averaged about 1 minute and 17 seconds on SportsCenter, which is almost 50% shorter than men's sports stories, and only 44 seconds on local television. They also found that commenters made jokes and used action-packed language with more rapid speech, often when discussing men's sports than women's sports. Also, women's sports only appeared 1 out of every 4 stories on local station and none on SportsCenter stories. Also, game footage highlighting impressive plays accompanied most of men's sports segments, and 83.1% of local news, and 88.6% of Sports Center stories, which is a lot more than women's.
Some things have gotten better. Organizations like the WSL or World Surf League have actually just set equal pay for male and female athletes. And subsequent to Title IX, women and girls have become much more involved in sports. College women's athletic participation has increased from 15% in 1972 to 43% in 2001. High school girls' athletic participation increased from 295,000 in 1971 to 2.8 million in 2003, an increase of over 840%. Today, the NCAA sponsors 40 women's championships, 38 men's championships, and 3 combined championships in all 3 of its divisions. Although all this is great, we still have a long way to go before everything's truly equal.
Hey, walk out the house with my swagger.